Hey there, gang. How you doing? Hope everyone's all right. Today we got an interesting one. This is a very early Ibanez guitar. I can't tell you the exact date because the rubber stamp that put the serial number in against the neck block missed a couple of the numerals, so I don't know exactly when, but I think it's probably very early 70s. This is lawsuit era Ibanez when they were doing Gibson clones. They call this one a Concorde, but it's essentially a Gibson Hummingbird 12-string. And it's very dirty. Hasn't been played for a lot of years. I like that's kind of a kooky take on the Ibanez logo. It's far out, man. I've been asked to do something a little out of the ordinary for this guitar. The owner is a finger picker, and he's sensitive to string placement and that kind of thing. What he wants me to do is take each individual pair of strings and reverse the order. So we're going to have the big string, the fundamental note, is going to be on top, rather than the octave string. Don't see that very often, unless you play Rickenbacker electric 12 strings. They've always done it that way. They're the only ones who do. I've never seen that on an acoustic 12 string. No one's ever asked me to do this, so this is brand new for me and should be kind of fun. Now to achieve that, we're obviously going to have to make him a new nut to accommodate the different widths of strings. But I'll also make a new saddle at the same time. We'll get rid of the plastic one here and put in a bone, and I'll file it for better intonation. If you've ever tried to finger pick a 12-string guitar, you know it can be kind of a frustrating experience. Strumming hides a lot, and when you're playing individual notes, sometimes the discrepancy between the intonation points of the thick and thin strings gets really kind of glaring, and you hear weird off beats and things never quite sync up. So we'll do what we can. And obviously in 1970s 12-string there's a bit of a hump. Not so much break angle, and the action is kind of on the high side of normal, so we have to sort of zhuzh it a little bit and see what we can get out of it, because we're not going to do a neck reset on this one. Okay, before I take the strings off, I'm going to get a quick check of the action here, so I know what I'm playing around with. I know it's going to be high. The 12th fret, bass side, we are at about 8/64ths, which is 1/8 of an inch, which is 125 thousandths, which is about 3.1 millimeters. Is everyone happy? Okay. That's as high as you would want it to be. I would not want a guitar with higher action. Anything more than that, you're getting into neck reset territory. Ordinarily, I'd much prefer to see it at like 6/64ths or 5 if I could get it. But given the vintage of this guitar and the fact that it's a 12 string, it's been under tension for a long time, and sometimes the action is going to be a little bit higher. Though I think I can squeeze a little bit more out of it. I know that the neck has got quite a bit of a bow. It's got too much relief, so if we straighten the truss rod, that should probably come down a little bit more. Let's do that first to see what we can get out of it. Okay, so capo at the 1st fret. I'm going to hold the heavier of the 6 strings down at the body joint and measure the relief at the 6th fret here. And I get around 23 thousandths of an inch, which is about twice what it should be. So that's more than half a millimeter. So there's some adjustment to do. I'm just going to detune things slightly so I don't have all that string tension working against this adjustment. And it actually takes quite a large Allen key. This is a 5mm. Most modern Asian guitars are 4mm rods. The annoying thing with a 12 string is you have so many strings to contend with for doing adjustments, and that's why you want to do a lot of it with the old strings on if possible, because you don't want to be tuning and retuning this thing 3 times with the new set of strings. And this is just sort of gross adjustment anyway. Oh, it's snug. Okay. I moved that almost a quarter turn, which is a lot. So I'll tune this up roughly again, and we'll check. Now we're down to 15, so we're about half the way there. Okay, with that adjustment, we're down to about 12 thousandths relief at the 6th fret, which is very nice. This is exactly where I want to be. And the action has come down, marginally. Still not great, but it's better than it was. Checking out the old nut here, they were, I'll call them generous, but they did not cut the nut slots as low as they should have. It's very stiff. So I know that when I make a new nut, I'll actually be improving the action because my strings won't be that far off the 1st fret. It's nice now that I've got this sort of basic idea of what the setup is like that I can take these strings off and I can project out for my new saddle and that kind of stuff. And I also know that the truss rod works, which is important. Let's take a second to appreciate this fret end here. Very interesting. The frets, these were flattened either with a file or a stone, but they weren't recrowned. They're very flat on top, so we're going to have to take care of that as well. Ugh, where's that guy with the wire brush? So I recrowned and polished all the frets. You can see here where some damage has occurred, and you might remember in my last 12-string video where I warned against making the string slots too deep relative to the space between them. Anything more than about half the diameter of the string, and there won't be enough structural integrity there. They'll just pop off. So this is a cautionary tale. This is a case where finish has been applied to the side of the nut, so we have to go ahead and score that before we knock off the nut. Otherwise we're in danger of, chipping out a big hunk of lacquer down here, which is no fun to repair. Block of wood up against the face. Couple of taps. And be careful again, because some lacquer could be sticking to the bottom of the nut. Like this side here is kind of tight. And here again we've had a lot of glue down on the bottom of the slot, and this resultant material loss when we come to take it out, which is why I tell builders put the glue on the inside surface, the end grain of the fingerboard, rather than down on that mahogany there, so we'll preserve a nice flat bottom and not rough it up with a bunch of tear out. Work on the nut proceeds. I'll flatten the face and also the bottom. I'll go ahead and I'll mark the side that will go against the fingerboard. Clean off any remnants of glue on the front edge of the fingerboard here, and also down in the corner. We'll re-establish a nice flat bottom to the nut slot. Take the bone nut blank, cut it to length. Use a half a pencil here to mark out the outline. It rides on the top of the frets and gives me something to work to. I'll use a jeweler's saw to get rid of most of the excess material. And then I can sand down using a flat sanding block to the top of the pencil line. It's a relatively thick line, and it gives me a margin of error for when I'm laying out the nut slots. Mark them out with calipers and rule. I will score the lines, deepen them slightly with a very thin X-Acto saw, a razor saw. That gives me a channel that acts almost like a pilot for my gauged nut slotting files. I like to do the bulk of the shaping with the nut off the guitar, obviously. There'll be some fine-tuning to do later on after the nut slots are cut to depth, but I polish everything I can now before I glue it on. In cases like this, where the nut sits on top of the headstock overlay, I do need to use a little bit of super glue to hold it in place. Turning to the saddle now, I'll use the 12-inch radius sanding block to make the profile. I'm just making sure the intonation points are going to be good here, so I've set it up with the outside E strings. And what I've got is a little piece of B string here. It's a 15 thousandths of an inch. And I can slip that on top of this saddle, which has a flat top, so it doesn't actually intonate anywhere except the front edge. And that gives it enough of a lift so that I can plot out where the front E is going to be, and I can switch that back and do the back side. Okay, so that's pretty good. The low E here intonates pretty accurately on the very back end of the saddle, and the high E is towards the front but not all the way at the front. So this is good. We can usually make things work with that. I don't have to recut the slot or anything. Here I'm filing back the intonation points for each string, trying to make it look aesthetically pleasing as well as functional. I'm using the rotary tool here to create some string slots. This will increase the break angle over the saddle and allow me to lower the action slightly. Dialing in the proper height for each string at the nut now. I'm going along and filing grooves for each of the strings here for two purposes. One, to keep them in line so they're in the right position, but also to adjust their height so that the tops of the strings are even relative to each other. This is a delicate balance, especially in this case where I can't take the octave strings down too far because there just isn't enough break angle, so I'm kind of balancing the two. It takes a long time and it can be pretty annoying, and you can see why most manufacturers don't do this. Doing the final shaping on the top of the nut here to reduce its height down to where it should be. If you find yourself in a situation where you need to take all the strings off the bridge on a 12-string guitar, in this case I want to take out the saddle and polish it and refine those slots that I made, use two capos on the neck. One up by the nut, one down by the body. If you don't, those strings will form themselves a knot that will take you at least an hour to untangle. Trust me. In addition, if you happen to work on a lot of 12 strings, it might be worth your time making up a couple of cork-padded thin pieces of wood here for use with some little tiny spring clamps. And that holds things in position as well. You know what might also work would be those commercially available mutes they sell for archtop guitars that go between the bridge and the tailpiece to cut down on vibration. I don't have one of those handy, but that might do the trick. Anyway, that just lets me take the strings out and they're not going to get into a terrible rat's nest while I do the work. Okay, here's a shot of the completed nut. You can see what I mean about not having the strings buried underneath the surface here. The slots aren't too deep and there's little chance that these pieces in between the string courses are going to pop off this time. The compensated saddle's all ready to go as well here. The final action turned out to be about 6/64, which is just over 2.3 millimeters, which is okay. It's all right. Actually, it's pretty good, to be honest, for a 50-year-old 12-string at standard pitch. Ordinarily, though, on a modern guitar, I'd take it lower than that. I can't do that in this case. This is as low as it will go. If I go too much lower, I'll start flopping around on the top of the saddle and cause a sitar-like buzz, which is no fun. I will say, though, that the bottom course here, when I first started strumming it, I noticed that I was getting some clanging between the two strings. And normally I go for about 2.5 millimeters between the courses at the bottom here. And it wasn't enough in this case. I had to go back and recut it. What I think is happening is the octave E is higher tension than the fundamental E. Ordinarily when you strum it, it's on the bottom and it seems to have more space to sort of move around after strumming, but in this case they were touching. Just the way the string was vibrating, it was causing a clash between the two of them, so I had to go back and recut that. Anyway, it's a cool guitar. I actually really like the neck on this thing. I like it better than a lot of Gibsons from this era, so it's got some things going for it. So how do I feel about the reverse stringing situation? You can tell the difference. If you're used to the standard and you pick up this one, it'll take about 5 minutes to get your mind wrapped around it. It's not so much more difficult, it just you have to interact with the strings in a slightly different way. Having the large string at the top here, if you come down on this with a really sort of rigid classical technique with a very high arch and use your fingertip, what can happen is you get the main string, the big string, and if you use just enough pressure to make that sound, like a really light touch, you can miss out on the harmonics. So I think in the standard way of doing things, it's easier, like you get more residual pressure on the fingertip. So in this case, you either have to increase the pressure or use a slightly sloppier technique where you roll your finger back and use more of the pad. You know who fascinates me? Dolly Parton. She's got those really long dragon lady fingernails, and somehow she manages to chord just fine by using the pads of her fingers rather than the fingertips. And that's kind of what you have to do here.